In 1861, on a cotton plantation 15 miles south of Little Rock, Arkansas, a woman named Sarah committed an act de derecho through the county's whispered histories for generations. She pushed her master, Colonel Edmund Hartwell, into the stone well behind the cook house on the night of December 25th, hours after he had blessed the Christmas table with scripture and prayers for the Confederacy's swift victory. You are watching Shadows of the South, where we unearth the most disturbing and forgotten stories of the slaveholding South. The tales that reveal what truly lay beneath the veneer of gentility and Christian virtue that the planter class so carefully cultivated. The Hartwell plantation stretched across 800 acres of fertile bottomland along the Arkansas River, a monument to the wealth that could be extracted from soil and human flesh. Colonel Edmund Hartwell, 43 years old, in that final Christmas of his life, had inherited the property from his father in 1847 and had expanded it considerably through advantageous cotton markets and what he considered shrewd management of his labor force. He was a man of moderate education, having studied 2 years at a Virginia military academy before returning home to learn the practical arts of planting. His neighbors considered him a gentleman of the old school, stern but fair, religious without being fanatical, a man who believed deeply in the natural order of things as he understood them. He kept approximately 220 enslaved people on his property, their quarters arranged in neat rows that could be seen from the upper windows of the main house, a reminder of the empire he commanded. His wife, Catherine, had died in childbirth 7 years earlier, leaving him with a daughter, Margaret, who was being educated at a finishing school in Nashville. Since Catherine's death, the management of the household had fallen to various enslaved women, but it was Sarah who had come to occupy the most complicated position in that architecture of power and captivity. Sarah was 31 years old in 1861, a woman of remarkable presence despite the circumstances that sought to diminish her. She had been born on a plantation in northern Mississippi and had been sold to Hartwell in 1854 after her previous master's bankruptcy. Her light brown skin and features suggested mixed ancestry, though she never spoke of her parentage, and those who knew better than to ask understood that silence itself was a story of violation. She had been trained as a house servant and possessed skills in cooking, sewing, and the kind of invisible attendance that wealthy households required. She could read, though this was a carefully guarded secret, having been taught by a previous mistress who had possessed abolitionist sympathies before marrying into a slaveholding family. Sarah had a son, Daniel, who was 9 years old and worked in the stables. The boy had his mother's intelligence and his father's features, and anyone with eyes could see that his father was Colonel Hartwell himself, though this truth was maintained in the peculiar silence that Southern society imposed on such matters. Sarah had 2 other children who had been sold away before she came to Arkansas, a boy and a girl, whose faces she kept behind her eyes in the moments before sleep. On the Hartwell plantation, she managed the main house alongside 3 other enslaved women, Beulah, who was 50 and nearly blind in one eye from a beating years earlier, Louisa, 24, who had a gift for needlework, and a son by an enslaved blacksmith, and young Penny, just 16, who had recently been brought up from the quarters to replace an older woman who could no longer manage the stairs. In the fields and workshops labored men whose names and stories formed their own constellation of suffering. Big Moses, the driver who carried out Hardwell's orders with a conflicted heart. Caleb, the carpenter whose hands could coax beauty from wood, even as those same hands bore scars from punishment. Samuel, the preacher who held secret services in the woods on Sunday evenings. And Isaac, the youngest field hand at 14, whose spirit had not yet been fully broken. The South in 1861 was a civilization built on a foundation of cultivated lies. The plantation aristocracy had convinced itself that slavery was not merely economically necessary but morally righteous, a benevolent institution that Christianized and civilized an inferior race. Ministers preached from pulpits about the biblical sanction for servitude. Politicians spoke eloquently about states' rights while defending the right to own human beings. Women who considered themselves ladies of refinement oversaw households where people were property, where children were born into bondage, where the rape of enslaved women was so common as to be beneath mention in polite society. The system required an extraordinary capacity for moral compartmentalization, a willingness to see enslaved people as simultaneously less than human, and yet human enough to be held responsible for their actions, to be punished, to be taught Christianity, to be trusted with the most intimate aspects of household life. This contradiction lived at the heart of Southern society, a rot that no amount of moonlight and magnolias could sweeten. Colonel Hartwell considered himself a Christian man, a believer in order and responsibility. He attended the Episcopal Church in town every Sunday, that weather and business permitted, and that the weather and business permitted, and they had family prayers read in the main house each evening. He believed that slavery, while perhaps unfortunate, was sanctioned by Scripture, and would exist until Providence saw fit to end it. He did not consider himself cruel. He rarely ordered whippings. He allowed his enslaved people garden plots and small privileges. He permitted marriages among them and even provided gifts at Christmas. That he had taken Sarah to his bed, beginning in 1856, 2 years after her arrival, did not strike him as contradicting his moral standing. He told himself that she had consented, that she seemed content with the arrangement, that he treated her with consideration. He did not, perhaps could not, understand that consent was impossible when one person owned another, that gentleness in the execution of violation did not transform it into something other than violation. When Daniel was born in 1857 with features that could not be denied, Hartwell ensured the boy received better treatment than most enslaved children. He was not sent to the fields at age 7. He was taught a trade. He was clothed adequately. Hartwell believed this constituted generosity, even love after a fashion. It never seemed to occur to him that he had given the child nothing that should not have been his birthright as a human being, or that Sarah might view the entire situation with feelings more complex than gratitude. The trigger for what happened on Christmas night, 1861, had been building for months, perhaps for years, but the immediate catalyst arrived 3 weeks before the holiday. Hartwell had been drinking more heavily than usual. The war was not progressing as Confederates had hoped. There were rumors of federal movements up the Arkansas River, and the price of cotton had become uncertain. On the night of December 4th, after drinking whiskey in his study, he had summoned Penny to his room. What happened there was heard by Sarah and Beulah, though they pretended not to hear, as survival required. Penny emerged hours later in a state of shock and pain, blood on her dress, and something broke in Sarah at that moment. Penny was barely older than Sarah's daughter would have been, the one who had been sold away. The girl sobbing in the kitchen that night. Beulah's attempts to comfort her, the brutal normality of it all. This was the moment when Sarah's compliance, maintained through 7 years of careful negotiation with her own captivity, began to fracture. She had endured her own violation, had made a kind of peace with it by telling herself she was protecting others, that her position gave her some power to shield those beneath her. But watching Hartwell expand his predations to include a child shattered that rationalization. Over the following weeks, Sarah began to plan, not a plan of escape, that was nearly impossible for a woman with a child, in a region fully committed to the Confederacy, where every white person was a potential enemy and every road led to patrollers. No, Sarah began to plan something else entirely, something that would require waiting for the right moment, the right circumstances. Pause for a moment and reflect on this. How does a person arrive at the decision to kill? For Sarah, it was not a sudden impulse born of rage, though rage was certainly present. It was a calculated conclusion reached after years of accumulated grief, humiliation, and helpless witness to atrocity. The system of slavery was designed to prevent such calculations, to make resistance seem impossible, to isolate each enslaved person in their suffering, so that collective action remained unthinkable. But slavery could not fully extinguish the human capacity for judgment, for moral reasoning, for the decision that some acts demand a response regardless of consequence. Christmas of 1861 arrived on a Wednesday. The weather had been cold for Arkansas, with frost silvering the fields each morning. Hardwell had arranged for a special celebration, extra rations for the enslaved quarters, a day without field work, and a formal dinner in the main house to which he had invited several neighboring planters and their families. The war was not going as hoped, and there was a desperate quality to the festivities, a determination to maintain the rituals of civilization, even as that civilization prepared to defend itself through armed rebellion. Sarah and the other house servants had been preparing for days, roasting a pig, baking peas and cakes, polishing silver, arranging evergreen boughs throughout the house. The air smelled of cinnamon and wood smoke, of the pine logs burning in every fireplace, of the particular mixture of anticipation and dread that permeated enslaved households during white celebrations. Sarah moved through her duties with her usual efficiency, her face revealing nothing. She served at table that evening, pouring wine, clearing plates, invisible in the way that enslaved servants were trained to be invisible. The guests talked of military victories at Manassas and Wilson's Creek, of their confidence in Southern arms, of their determination to resist Northern aggression. They spoke of these matters in front of the servants, as if discussing the weather, as if the people who served them had no stake in the outcome, no interior lives capable of hope or fear regarding their own potential freedom. After the guests departed near midnight, Hardwell was in high spirits, flushed with wine and the evening's conversation. He told Sarah to remain behind as the other servants were dismissed to their quarters. She had expected this, had known that Christmas night would not pass without demands being made upon her body. What she had not fully anticipated was that Hardwell would also call for Penny, making clear his intention to take both women to his bed. This was the moment when calculation and rage converged. Sarah told Hartwell that there was special brandy stored in the spring house near the well, a bottle that had been his father's, worth saving for such an occasion. Hartwell, drunk and pleased with himself, agreed to walk out with her to retrieve it. The night was cold and clear, stars visible in vast profusion above the dark fields. Their breath made clouds in the lamplight as they walked the stone path from the house to the cookhouse and beyond it to the well. The well was old, built by Hartwell's grandfather, a deep stone shaft sunk 40 feet into the earth. There was no fence around it, only a low stone corb and a wooden cover that was usually in place, but had been left partially open because one of the ropes had broken earlier that day. What happened next took perhaps 30 seconds. Hardwell bent over the stone corb, holding the lamp and peering down into the darkness, remarking that he could not see the water level. Sarah, standing behind him, experienced a moment of absolute clarity. She saw her entire life. The children sold away, the years of violation, Penny sobbing, Daniel's uncertain future, the endless tunnel of captivity stretching forward. She placed both hands on Hartwell's back and pushed. He had time to turn his head, to see her face, to understand what was happening, but not time to catch himself. The lamp fell with him, and there was a long moment of silence punctuated only by the sound of impact, and then water and then nothing. Sarah stood at the well's edge, listening. There was no cry for help, no sound of movement. Either Hartwell had been knocked unconscious by the fall, or the cold water had shocked him beyond the ability to respond. She waited 5 minutes, 10, listening with absolute attention. Then she returned to the house, her face composed, and told Beulah that the master had sent her to bed, that they had gone to check on something in the barn. She went to her small room of the kitchen, lay down on her pallet, and waited for morning. The discovery came at dawn, when one of the stable hens went to draw water and found the well cover displaced and the colonel's body floating below. The alarm spread quickly. Shouts, running feet, the organized chaos of a plantation, confronted with the death of its master. The overseer, a hard man named Tate, who lived in a cabin between the main house and the quarters, immediately assumed foul play, but the circumstances seemed to suggest accident. Hardwell was known to have been drinking the night before. The rope on the well was broken, the stone corb was icy. Still, Tut ordered all the enslaved people assembled and questioned. Sarah, along with every other person who had been in the main house the previous evening, was interrogated. She told her story simply. The master had dismissed her. She had gone to bed. She had heard nothing unusual. Beulah confirmed that Sarah had returned to the house and retired for the night. There was no evidence, no witness, nothing to contradict the story. And yet, in a society built on the assumed docility and fear of enslaved people, the overseer remained suspicious. He ordered several men whipped on general principle, a demonstration of power in the face of uncertainty. But he could not prove anything against Sarah specifically. Consider for a moment the position Sarah occupied in those days following Hartwell's death. She had committed an act of violence that the society around her could scarcely conceive of, an enslaved woman killing her master, and doing so with premeditation and calculation. The law of Arkansas, like that of all slave states, made such an act not merely murder, but a crime against the entire social order. If discovered, she would be executed publicly, probably after torture, as an example to every other enslaved person in the region. She knew this with absolute certainty, and yet she maintained her composure, continued her duties, submitted to questioning without betrayal of emotion. It was a performance of extraordinary discipline, one that would have been impossible without years of training in the suppression of authentic feeling that slavery required. The plantation fell into a kind of suspended animation as arrangements were made for Hartwell's burial and the settling of his estate. His daughter Margaret was summoned from Nashville, arriving a week later, a pale girl of 16 who had last seen her father in August. The funeral was held on a gray Saturday morning, attended by planters from throughout the region, their families, the ministers, the merchants who had done business with Hartwell. The enslaved people of the plantation were required to attend as well, standing in separate sections, their heads bowed as the Episcopal minister intoned the service. Sarah stood among them, her son Daniel beside her, and listened as the minister spoke of Hartwell's virtues, his Christian character, his devotion to his family and his duty. No mention was made of the 220 people he had owned, of the children sold away from mothers, of the women taken to his bed, of the economic engine of suffering that had built his wealth. The language of the service rendered Hartwell as victim, a good man taken too soon by unfortunate accident. Sarah listened and said nothing. In the weeks following the funeral, the true consequences of Hartwell's death began to unfold. His estate entered probate, and it emerged that he had been deeply in debt, the plantation mortgaged, creditors circling, his affairs less prosperous than his lifestyle had suggested. Margaret, as his heir, was faced with decisions she was too young to make and too sheltered to understand. Her guardian, an uncle from Memphis, arrived to manage matters and quickly decided that the plantation should be sold, the assets liquidated to satisfy debts. This meant that all the enslaved people would be auctioned, families separated, the fragile networks of relationship and community that had been built despite captivity now tore apart. The news spread through the quarters like illness, the knowledge that in a matter of weeks they would all be scattered, sold to whoever would pay the best price. For Sarah, this meant that she would almost certainly be separated from Daniel, that her act of violence had protected no one, had changed nothing, had only accelerated the destruction she had sought to prevent. The auction was held on a cold morning in late February 1862. Buyers came from throughout Arkansas and from neighboring estates, men examining enslaved people like livestock, checking teeth and muscles, asking about skills and temperament. Sarah and Daniel stood on the auction block together, and she held her son's hand as the bidding proceeded. But they were not sold as a unit. Sarah went to a cotton merchant from Mississippi, Daniel to a planter from Louisiana. The moment of separation was brief and brutal. No time for farewell, just the severing of connection and Daniel's voice calling for her as he was led away. Sarah was taken that same day, shackled in a wagon with 6 other people purchased by the same buyer, driven south toward Mississippi. She never saw her son again. Yet the story does not quite end there, because stories like these never truly end. They echo forward, shape lives not yet lived, inscribe themselves into the moral ledger that societies carry whether they acknowledge it or not. In the years after Sarah's departure from Arkansas, rumors began to circulate about Coronel Hartwell's death. Perhaps someone had overheard something, perhaps Penny or Beulah had shared a suspicion, perhaps the timing and circumstances had simply seemed too convenient. The story began to change shape in the telling, transforming from accident to possible murder, and Sarah's name became attached to the whispers. By the time the war ended in 1865, the story had become a kind of legend in that part of Arkansas, the enslaved woman who had killed her master on Christmas night and walked away unpunished. It was told as a ghost story, as a cautionary tale, as a story of divine justice or unholy revenge depending on who was telling it. The well itself became a seat of superstition, and eventually it was filled in and the ground planted over, as if erasing the physical location could erase the memory of what had happened there. Pause now and reflect on what this story reveals about the nature of power and resistance. Sarah's act was both triumph and tragedy. Triumph in that she asserted her own humanity and moral judgment against a system that denied both, tragedy in that the system ultimately defeated her anyway, separating her from her child and delivering her back into captivity. She saved no one, freed no one, changed no structural reality, and yet her act mattered because it demonstrated that even in the most totalizing systems of oppression, the human capacity for moral agency persists. Every enslaved person who heard some version of Sarah's story would have understood this, would have recognized it as evidence that resistance was possible even when victory was not. What became of Sarah after her sale to Mississippi is not recorded in any document that survives. The merchant who purchased her kept cursory records, and she appears in his ledger only as a line item, a piece of property transferred and put to work. She may have labored in his household or been wrestled again, may have survived the war and the cause of emancipation, or may have died in captivity, her body buried in an unmarked grave like so many millions of others. Daniel's fate is similarly obscure, though there is a fragmentar, record of a man named Daniel Hartwell, who appeared in Louisiana Reconstruction-era documents, a freedman who worked as a carpenter and who had a son named Edmund, perhaps in bitter irony, or perhaps in an attempt to claim the patrimony that had been denied. If this was Sarah's son, he survived to see freedom, but he would have carried for his entire life the memory of that February morning when he was sold away from his mother, the last image of her face as the wagon pulled away. The Hartwell plantation itself did not survive the war intact. The main house burned in 1864, under circumstances that were never fully explained. Federal troops were blamed, though there were also stories of the enslaved people who remained on the property taking their own revenge against the structures of their captivity. By the time Reconstruction arrived, the land had been subdivided and sold. The fields returned to different kinds of agriculture, the quarters demolished or repurposed. Margaret Hartwell married a doctor from Little Rock in 1866 and moved to Texas, reportedly never speaking of her father or the plantation or the life she had known before the war. She died in childbirth in 1870, ending the Hartwell line. The family that had considered itself aristocracy, that had built its fortune on the bodies of enslaved people, disappeared from history except as a notation in county records and an unmarked family plot in a churchyard. But the memory of Sarah persisted in the oral stories of the black community in that region of Arkansas, passed down through generations as a story of resistance and sacrifice. To the descendants of enslaved people, Sarah was not a murderer, but an avenger, a woman who had struck a blow against her oppressor, even knowing the cost. Her story was told alongside others like it, the accumulated testimony of resistance that existed beneath the surface of slavery's official history, the poisonings and arsons, the work slowdowns and tool breakings, the escapes and rebellions, and small acts of sabotage that made slavery less profitable and more unstable than slaveholders wanted to admit. These stories formed a counter-narrative to the myth of the contented slave, the benevolent master, the civilized South. They revealed the truth that slavery's defenders worked so hard to conceal, that the system was maintained through terror and violence, that enslaved people recognized its evil and resisted it in whatever ways they could, that the moral rot at slavery's core poisoned everyone it touched. The institution of slavery destroyed bodies, but it also destroyed souls, the souls of those who were enslaved, forced to witness and endure and survive atrocities that should never have been inflicted, and also the souls of those who enslaved, who participated in a system that required them to deny the humanity of people they lived alongside, who raised children to believe that owning other human beings was natural and right. Colonel Edmund Hartwell was formed by such a system, taught from childhood that his status as a white man of property gave him absolute dominion over those he enslaved, that their bodies and labor and lives were his to use as he saw fit. He believed himself a good man within that system, a Christian man, a man of honor. He could not or would not see that the system itself was evil, that no amount of personal kindness or paternalistic care could redeem it, that every day he participated in it, he was committing moral violence. When Sarah pushed him into that well on Christmas night, 1861, she was enacting a judgment that the system itself would never have rendered, asserting a moral clarity that slaveholding society rejected as impossible. The legacy of slavery continues to shape American society more than a century and a half after emancipation. The wealth accumulated through stolen labor, the social structures built to maintain racial hierarchy, the trauma passed down through generations, the stories deliberately forgotten or suppressed, all of these continue to influence our present. Understanding stories like Sarah's is part of the necessary work of reckoning with this history, of seeing clearly what was done, and acknowledging the full humanity of those who suffered under slavery's regime. It requires us to look unflinchingly at the moral catastrophe that slavery represented, to recognize that it corrupted everyone it touched, and to understand that the work of repair and justice remains urgent and unfinished. As you reflect on this story and others like it, consider what they reveal about the nature of power, resistance, and human dignity. Consider how systems of oppression create their own opposition, how the denial of basic humanity generates forces that threaten the very order that the oppression seeks to maintain. Consider the choices that people made within impossible circumstances, the calculations of survival and resistance, the moments when compliance gave way to action despite terrible consequences. And consider your own relationship to this history, how it has shaped the world you inherit, what responsibilities it creates for understanding and addressing the legacies of injustice that persist. The well into which Sarah pushed Colonel Hartwell on Christmas night 1861 is long gone, filled in and built over, the land transformed by time and the passage of history. But the story remains, carried forward by those who refuse to let it be forgotten, a testimony to the human capacity for resistance even in the face of overwhelming power, a reminder of the moral debt that slavery created and that has never been fully repaid. Sarah's name survives in these whispered stories, not as a cautionary tale about the dangers of slave rebellion, as white society might have framed it, but as evidence of the unbreakable human spirit, the assertion of dignity and moral judgment that no system of oppression can fully extinguish. Her story, and the millions of stories like it, demand to be remembered, honored, and understood as central to the American experience, not peripheral to it. They reveal the true cost of slavery, measured not only in economic terms or political conflict, but in human suffering, moral corruption, and the violence required to maintain an unjust order. This is the history that Shadows of the South exist to uncover and preserve, the stories that reveal what lie beneath the mythology of the Old South and that continue to speak to us across the decades, insisting that we see clearly, remember faithfully, and reckon honesty with the past that made our present possible.